Now one of the first things we have to do is chock our front wheels so the truck can't roll, and then we're going to go ahead and put it in neutral. Okay friends, one of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support the rear of the truck, and then of course we're going to remove all of our lug nuts and then the wheel. To do is go ahead and remove our caliper to caliper slider bolts. There's going to be 2 of them. We need to get them both out of there. Remove your caliper. Get this off of there. Now you're going to want to inspect your caliper. If you see any fluid that looks like it's coming out of this boot right here, that means that you have to replace your caliper. As you can tell, this one's been leaking for a while. It needs to be replaced. Let's go ahead and get these pads out of here. Well, there we are. Now the next thing we need to do is remove our caliper bracket bolts. Now the next thing we're going to do is take one of our lug nuts and start it onto one of the lug studs. After you've done that, let's continue on by removing the rotor. Now the next thing we're going to do is lift up on our e-brake shoe and remove it from its clip that's under here. There we are. Now you can lift this up. And at this point, if you just carefully try to twist this around, you'll be able to slide it off of here. Now the next thing we have to do is remove our fill plug for the rear differential. Let's go ahead and remove all of our pan cover bolts and then remove the pan cover. So now we're just going to turn our drive shaft so we can see this right here and this bolt right there. You want it essentially so this shaft right here will be able to slide out and down at an angle, and we'll have complete access to this bolt. Go ahead and loosen that up. Now we're just going to carefully pull this out, and you want to make sure that this piece right here doesn't fall out and hit the ground. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reach up along the top of this carefully, and I'm going to push down on the upper end of this pin and pull it out to my hand. Inspect this and set it aside. So now that we have the pin out that comes through here, what we need to do is spin the drive shaft a little bit more so that this rectangular area right here is kind of facing up and down. Once we've done that, we're going to go to the outer portion of the axle, push it in a little bit, and that's going to drop a little horseshoe clip down and into the differential. So now looking up along the top area here, you can see that you have the mechanism for your limited slip. We want that up along the top, and you want the hole with none of the mechanism under here, because that's where the clip is going to come through. There's one. Let's just grab the pair of those out of there. There's one. Now you're going to want to make sure you have a collection bucket underneath this, because we're going to go ahead and draw the axle out of the differential tube. There we are. Set this aside. Now we're just going to take a look at this area right along here. This is where the bearing's going to ride, and then along this area right here is where the seal's going to ride. You can tell that they're a little bit discolored, but if you were to go ahead and feel it, try to feel it with your nail a little bit. If you don't feel any grooves that are worn into it, it should be okay. You just want to clean this down. Now the next thing we're going to do is continue on with a nice pry bar. I'm going to get right inside this area here and try to pry up against as close to the tube as I can without actually damaging the tube. There it is, friends. Now that the seal's out of the way, the next thing we need to do is continue on by removing the bearing. It's not just necessarily going to fall out of here, you need to continue on with a slide hammer. To do that, I'm going to use this adapter. I'm going to come along the back side of the bearings, grab onto it like this, and then I'll press the washer up against it flat and tighten it down. Now that we have our adapter on there, let's continue on by mounting our slide hammer. There we are. There it is, friends. Okay, now that the bearing's out, let's continue on by wiping out this area so it's nice and clean. Okay, friends, now it's time to get ready for our install. We're just going to take our bearing, line it up so it starts going into the differential tube as straight as possible. Now I'm going to take my bearing installer with the proper size adapter, one that can fit inside of this tube. I'm going to go ahead and put it right along the bearing and then drive it in. What we're doing at this point is we're listening to it. I can hear that it's going bonk, 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 but as soon as it gets to the end, it's going to go ting at the end. You can hear there's an audible difference. That means that it's bottomed out. Now it's going to be time to install our brand new seal. A couple things that we want to pay attention to is on the inner area here where the rubber is, you're going to find that there's a little metal spring. I like to use a little bit of petroleum jelly, that way there the spring doesn't fall out. Now that we have the petroleum jelly in there, we're going to continue on to this outer area here. That's going to be the area that hits up against the differential tube. So we want to make sure that that's nice and sealed. I'm going to continue on using some gasket maker. Let's put a little bit on there. And then of course we'll just spread it along the entire outside. Okay, now that we have the seal coated with that gasket maker, let's continue on by sliding it into where it needs to go. Now I'm going to use this nice and flat with my driver, and I'm going to go ahead and press it in until it hits up against the differential. Once again, we're listening for an audible noise difference. Let's go ahead and wipe down the excess. Just make sure that it's sitting the way that it needs to. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is continue on with some of our 80/90 gear oil. We're going to go ahead and put it right along this bearing area here, and then of course we'll spin the bearings around just to make sure everything's nice and lightly coated. Perfect. Now's the time to go ahead and do the same on the other side of the truck. Alright, so now the next thing we have to do is go ahead and clean down our axle. Give it a nice spray. We want to make sure we get off any of the existing debris that might be on it. Especially in this area down along here. This is where the bearing and your seal is going to ride. Okay, so now that this is nice and clean, go ahead and try to take your finger and just feel if you feel any grooves. If you feel any grooves, you need to make sure you sand it down. This feels good. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and get our axle in here. Let's carefully just bring it in. We want to be very careful not to damage our brand new seal. Once you feel as though it stops, it's because it's hitting up against the gear inside. Go ahead and gently move it around a little bit. You should feel it want to slide in. There we are. Let's do the same to the other side of the truck. Okay, so now looking inside of our differential, if I was to grab onto one of my axles and move it in and out, you can see where the little slot is that our retainer needs to go. This is the retainer. You want to inspect it, make sure it's still in good condition. We're going to continue on by lining up the axle. So now you can see where the slot is. I'll take my clip. I'm going to slide it right in just like that. And then we're going to grab our axle and pull it away from the differential. That locks it in. Let's do the same to the other one. Now let's go ahead and clean off our pin. You have the area that has the hole through it. That's going to line up with the area where the bolt's going to go through. I'm just going to take this, put it so the bolt hole is going side to side, and then I'm going to carefully slide it up and in. If it doesn't seem like it wants to line up very well, you can just try to twist your axles from one side or the other. Don't go very far. We just want to essentially see if we can get this to want to set in. Okay, now it's going to be time to put in our retaining bolt here. And then of course we'll snug it up. Just going to use a little squirt of blue thread locker on the threads. Okay, so that's bottomed out. Let's give it a little extra. You definitely want to make sure that this is tight, and you definitely want to make sure that there's some blue thread locker. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is take one of my nice clean rags, and I'm going to go ahead and cover this gear right here. After that, let's continue on with our scraper, and we're going to get rid of any of the debris that's located on the differential itself. Now that I have this all cleaned down, I'm just going to go ahead and wipe out the inside here, because you're going to notice that there's going to be a lot more gear oil in there. Next, we need to go ahead and clean down the pan. We want to make sure we get off any of this debris and of course any of the existing gasket maker. And then we'll do the same to the threads on our bolts. Okay, so now that we have the pan and the bolts nice and cleaned down, let's continue on by using a little bit of gasket maker right along the edge where it's going to mount up against the differential. Just going to go ahead and put this on here. We're going to make a nice thin layer at the end. All right, so now that we have that on there, let's continue on to putting this up and onto the truck. There we are. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and start in all of our bolts and then we'll snug them up. Now let's just double check them, make sure they're nice and snug. Now back out with the brakes. What we're going to continue on by doing is adding a little bit of grease inside of each of these ports. Now let's continue on to cleaning these up as well. Okay, so now that we have these cleaned up, let's just continue on with a tiny bit of grease on this threaded area here. We'll go ahead and screw that right in. Now with that screwed in, let's continue on to adding a little bit more grease along this area right there. And then of course, why not just fill in this hole as well. Now on this other piece, we're going to continue on. We'll fill in that hole once again. And then we'll, of course, get along the outside area. And now we'll just grab our little piton and put it right in there. Let's get back over to the truck. All right, now it's going to be time to put our pieces in. You're going to notice the side that has the little cog needs to go up against this area here. Slide it right in there. After that, let's continue on with this one. We'll slide it in. We've got our little piton. That's going to fit onto the little arm that's on the inside. There we are. So now let's just go ahead and squeeze on these two little pins, and then we're going to come back here to the e-brake lever and just try to pull on that. Essentially, we want to make sure that these move. If they don't, then that means that this lever right here isn't pushed in far enough and it's not activating these. Now we're just going to use a little bit of brake caliper grease. I'm going to go right along the raised areas on the backing plate. You're going to find one here, and you'll find one over on the same area on the other side. And of course, we'll just come right up and in between this area here as well. Now it's going to be time to put on our e-brake shoe. Let's go ahead and carefully put it over this. Now when we put this on, we want the two ears on the e-brake shoe to fit into the ears that are on the e-brake adjuster / actuator. Just going to go ahead and line it up with both of those. And then of course we have to put it up along the top and make sure it slides inside this area here in between the backing plate and the clip itself. All right. So we definitely have it inside the clip here. You want to make sure of that so this can't move around. And you also want to make sure that it's sitting into the grooves along here. If it isn't, like this one right here, just go ahead and spin it until it is. Now we need to take a look right down here to the emergency brake adjuster. This is something that we're going to have to adjust to make sure that the e-brake shoe is close enough to the rotor without actually necessarily touching it. And give it a nice little turn like this. Now at this point, we're just going to listen for a little bit of friction. I don't really hear anything, so that means that my shoes need to be adjusted out a little bit. So for the driver's side, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto this, and I'm going to turn it clockwise. That's going to end up pushing out the shoe a little bit, so let's go ahead and grab the rotor and try again. Now at this point, I can hear a tiny bit of drag, but I definitely don't feel any resistance on the rotor. If you hear drag and you have resistance, then that means that you're a little bit too tight. Now back over at the truck, let's continue by putting on our caliper bracket with our caliper bracket bolts. I always like to use a little bit of red thread locker on these. We'll go ahead and snug them up, and then we'll torque them to 52 foot-pounds. Okay, now it's going to be time to put on our brake pads. What you're going to notice is you have wear indicators on them. We want to essentially line these up so we have the wear indicators both facing on the same side here. Let's put the top area in, line up the bottom, and put that in as well. You should feel these be able to flow nicely. Do the same for the outer pad. That feels good. Now let's take our caliper, slide it right over those pads, push in on the sliders so we can slide the caliper over it, and then of course we'll put on our slider bolts with a little bit of red thread locker. Okay, now let's go ahead and snug them up and torque them to 23 foot-pounds. I'm going to hold the slider so it doesn't spin and snug it up. Okay, now it's time to fill our rear differential fluid. We're going to do that right here, and when you fill it, you're going to use 80-90 gear oil. So now I'm on my second pint of this, and something that I want to mention real quick is we want to continue filling until we have a very slight trickle coming out of the differential. That's when we know it's full. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of fluid coming out the top here, we know that this is full, so let's put in our fill plug. Now it's going to be time to put in our fill plug. We'll start that in, we'll snug it up. Okay, right there it bottomed out, just a teeny bit more. Now if you look at the threaded area, you can tell that this plug only went in approximately halfway. You don't necessarily need to keep going in until it's completely flush with the differential. Let's go ahead and get the wheel up on here, hopefully. Start on all of our lug nuts, we'll snug them up, and then we'll get it on the ground and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you have your lug nut covers, let's go ahead and make sure we put those on as well. There we are. Now all you have left to do is go ahead and pump up the brake pedal, check your master cylinder for your brake fluid, and of course, take it for a road test.